morning everybody, good morning, it's JPR and welcome back to another video. So the last time that we were here, I know it's been a while, we discussed Pokemon with regional forms that drastically improved upon the originals. And so this time we're taking it a step farther and discussing Pokemon whose cross-generation evolutions gave them a massive boost in viability. To start off, by cross-generation evolution, I mean an evolution that was added in a later generation that didn't originally exist alongside the base form. One of my favorite examples to start with is Onix. Perhaps no Pokemon from Gen 1 was truly as unlucky as Onix. Despite being the first major boss Pokemon of the game with an overwhelming height of nearly 29 feet, or just a couple of centimeters on your Game Boy screen, but use your imagination, Onix in reality is much less intimidating. If I asked you who has the lower attack stat, Onix or Oddish, I bet most people would overwhelmingly say Oddish, but as you probably guessed using context clues by now, that answer couldn't be any more wrong. In fact, Onix actually has the lowest attack stat of all fully evolved Gen 1 Pokemon aside from Chansey. Remember, Steelix and Blissey didn't exist yet. Even with its gargantuan 160 base defense, it means almost nothing thanks to its fragile typing and its extreme lack of useful status moves. Steelix, on the other hand, was an absolute titan of strength in the Gen 2 meta, consistently being ranked among the top 10 Pokemon in the top tier. Mostly because the average Gen 2 match lasts longer than the director's cut of Lord of the Rings, but I digress. Being one of the first major steel types in the game allowed to counter many of the meta's most fearsome Pokemon at the time, most notably including Snorlax. And with a base attack stat of 85, it may not seem all that impressive, but it at least has the option to fight back, which Onix sadly never possessed. While Steelix has certainly fallen a bit from its Gen 2 days of glory, at the very least it continues to be a mildly useful Pokemon both in terms of main story playthroughs and the lower tiers of competitive battling. Speaking of Gen 1 Pokemon that weren't originally Steel types but eventually got a cross-gen evolution that is Steel type even though they got retconned as Steel types later on, okay, this transition was not nearly as good as it sounded in my head, we have Magnezone. Now truthfully, there wasn't really anything wrong with Magneton at the time that Magnezone was introduced. Thanks to the introduction of Magnet Pull and Hidden Power, Magneton comfortably rested at the top of the Gen 3 meta as one of the greatest Steel types and ironically enough, the best Steel type killer. But Game Freak must have foreseen the horrific power creep atrocities they were about to commit, and decided to introduce Magnezone as a countermeasure to keep this Pokemon relevant. And really, they didn't change much of anything about how this Pokemon ticks. It still runs largely the same sets as Magneton, just with a little extra oomph to its attacks and bulk to keep it alive. And with just that small change, Magnezone's managed to keep itself in the top tier competitive battling for the better part of the last 15 years. If there's one thing that Generation 2 is absolutely notorious for, aside from bad level scaling and bad move pools and, okay, you get the point, it would be a lot of the bad Pokemon that were introduced. For whatever reason, there's just a ton of Pokemon that feel like they were purposely left incomplete and unusable. Dunsparce, Girafarig, Aipom, like seriously, how did Pokemon with this little viability actually get greenlit? I know Game Freak is known for making some, less than logical decisions sometimes, but this seems egregiously bad. Even for them. Perhaps no Pokemon who embodies this more though is Yanma. Say what you will about Dunsparce, at least some people figured out how to use this thing with Serene Grace. That's more redeeming qualities than Yanma had for the first 7 years of its existence. This Pokemon was downright terrible, with awful stats and everything aside from speed. But Yanmega was exactly the cure this thing needed, with a special attack stat that actually allows it to deal some damage, and with its two abilities, Speed Boost and Tinted Lens, this Pokemon has multiple ways to make itself into a deadly sweeper. But Yanma wasn't the only Gen 2 Pokemon to undergo a massive glow up in Gen 4, as Gligar received arguably one of the best cross-generation evolutions of all time. Now, don't get me wrong, Gligar was never as bad as the likes of Yanma or Aipom, and it always had a decent niche as a defensive wall with really good typing, but Gliscor is an example of how just a few small tweaks can take a serviceable Pokemon and make it absolutely busted. Stat-wise, Gliscor isn't very different from Gligar. Aside from getting 20 in attack and defense, it only gains 10 points in every other stat. But this is just enough to make Gliscor play whatever role it wants to. If you want to be a Swords Dancer with Earthquake and other coverage moves, go right ahead. Do you want to be an impenetrable wall that takes advantage of its obnoxiously good ability Poison Heal? Go right ahead. Do you want to be a support mon that whittles down teams with Knockoff and Spikes and Stealth Rock? Go right ahead. Point is, this Pokemon has the tools to do literally anything, and it's one of the very few Pokemon to stay in the top tier competitive battling ever since it was introduced to the game. Well, except in Sword and Shield where it just wasn't in the game, but it still made BDSPOU that generation if that's any consolation. I know, I try not to acknowledge that game unless I absolutely have to. Gliscor even briefly did some time in Uber's jail in Gen 9, as there was a period of time where it was simply too much for the competition to handle. And while it's since been allowed back in OU, I wouldn't say it's out of the woods just yet. But yeah, who would have imagined that this goofy looking flying scorpion would one day turn to one of the most feared Pokemon in the entire meta? If there's one line who may win the award for most improved family over time though, it would have to be the Togepi line. In Gen 2, Togepi was introduced as nothing more than a gimmick, essentially just the poster child for the much-loathed baby Pokemon category. And its evolution, Togetic, wasn't much better. And looking at its stats and move pool, it's easy to tell why. This Pokemon has a total identity crisis. It has stats that kinda make it look like it's supposed to be a tank, but really only on the special side, but with a move pool that seems much more oriented towards being an attacker. So what does Togekiss do? Well, why not both? With stats that are excellently distributed, a solid ability in Serene Grace, and a move pool that lets it play support or attacker, Togekiss may just be one of Pokemon's greatest cross-gen evolutions. And to make things even better, 2 generations after its introduction, it would be retconned as a fairy flying type, making it even better at playing both offense and defense. This next Pokemon is one that got saved by its cross-gen evolution not just once, but twice. Sneasel. While many of Sneasel's initial problems were due to Pokemon's physical special split that wasn't fixed until Gen 4, it's hard to deny that Weavile didn't fix the remainder of those problems, just by being a little faster and hitting a lot harder. And this small buff in stats was enough to keep Weavile relevant for a long time. But then, for some reason, Game Freak said, you know what, maybe Weavile just isn't good enough. And so they decided to release the absolute beast that is Sneasler. Okay, yeah, it technically evolves from Hisuian Sneasel, so it's not a true cross-gen evolution, you could argue, but hey, I just wanted to talk about this guy. When it's your video, you can make your own rules. Sneasler is an absolute freak of nature. With one of the best offensive typings in the game, a ridiculous signature move in Dire Claw, which has a 50% chance of inflicting 1 of 3 random statuses, Sword Stance, Close Combat, U-Turn, Unburden, which doubles its speed when it loses an item, and then Acrobatics that do double damage when you've lost said item. Yeah, this Pokemon was just born better than the rest. Which begs the question, why was this the one that went extinct? Even in Gen 9's extremely power-crept metagame, Sneasler still managed to get itself banned to Ubers. And unlike Gliscor, the odds of it ever returning look minuscule at best. This thing ain't just your sweeper, it's a Swiffer sweeper. Not sponsored, by the way. But yeah, rather ironic that Sneasel, perhaps one of the unluckiest Pokemon of the 2nd generation, ended up getting 2 amazing evolutions down the road. Hi there, it's me again. Editor, do something cool, like put me in Minecraft. That's better. Just wanted to say that if you're enjoying this video, then be sure to subscribe and leave a like, it really helps me out. Thank you so much. But there's one last Gen 2 Pokemon we need to talk about. And no, it's not Dunsparce, it's not Stantler, and it's not even Quillfish, although all of these guys did get a lot of help from their evolutions. In fact, this is a Pokemon that I seriously doubt anybody ever thought would have evolved. Ursaring. Ursaring is a Pokemon that at first was actually quite good. With a massive attack stat and a scary ability in Guts, it was able to hold its own as one of the game's best wall breakers. But, as is the case with many early generation Pokemon, Ursaring just wasn't able to keep up with the rising competition as time marched on. And now it's relegated to the bottom tier. But then Ursaluna came along and changed everything. Ursaluna may very well be one of the game's greatest Trick Room sweepers, with a monstrous attack stat of 140 and still has the aforementioned Guts ability. But if that wasn't convincing enough, less than 2 years after Ursaluna's introduction, Game Freak said, hey, let's take things a step further by making one of the most ridiculous forms of all time. And I mean ridiculous in terms of how good it is, not the design, that goes hard. In fact, I wonder if they actually made this thing because some guy in the office was like, yo, wouldn't it be rad if Ursaluna actually looked like this? Blood Moon Ursaluna is perhaps the most unnecessary upgrade made to a Pokemon, maybe ever. Almost nothing stands in this thing's way. Getting hit in the side of the head with a metal baseball bat hurts less than watching one of your Pokemon get hit by a Blood Moon. So really, it doesn't matter. Base form or Blood Moon, singles or VGC, Ursaluna is just a Pokemon that wreaks havoc wherever it goes. So while Ursaluna was a bit of an unexpected evolution, I have to say, nothing quite makes as little sense as the Applin family. This guy already had 2 evolutions in Gen 8, which were essentially version exclusives, and then it gets another DLC exclusive evolution in Gen 9, and then the next DLC says, wait, we're not done yet. Call right now and we'll double that offer. And so now, these guys just look terrible compared to Dipplin because Hydrapple exists for the sole reason of making Kieran a cooler final boss. But yeah, suddenly this rather underwhelming family of apple worms now includes one of the scariest new Dragon-type Pokemon. Fickle Beam alone having a 30% chance of becoming a 160 base power move with no drawbacks alone is enough to justify using this thing. And that's not even considering how wild its stats are. But is this really the most significant cross-gen evolution from Scarlet and Violet? I would say no. Yeah, okay, Dunsparce was one that we waited for a long time, but it's still far from the best. King Gambit is a pretty solid upgrade and competitive staple right now, but Bisharp was already not that bad of a Pokemon. No, if you ask me, the wildest step up is easily Annihilape. Like Ursaluna, Annihilape was certainly not an evolution that most people would have expected. Taking advantage of its above-average bulk and insane signature move Rage Fist, Annihilape was one of the very first competitive bands made in Gen 9. After a certain point, this Pokemon just becomes an unstoppable steamroller. Not to mention, Annihilape's mere existence also gives Primeape to make Rage Fist absurdly powerful as well, as it can now take advantage of the Eviolite item to boost its defenses. So on that note, what about when an evolution quite literally makes the original Pokemon better? Prior to Gen 5, this was pretty much impossible, but because of the aforementioned Eviolite item, many Pokemon have actually managed to outclass or at least stay on equal footing with their evolutionary relatives. And oddly, many of these examples are Pokemon with cross-gen evolutions. Chansey, Porygon too, but perhaps the most noteworthy examples, at least in the VGC format, would be Dusclops and Murkrow. At the beginning of the Scarlet and Violet VGC meta, some of you may remember how Murkrow was literally dominating the meta as one of the bulkiest prankster Pokemon with access to Tailwind, Taunt, and a plethora of other useful status moves. Unfortunately, Murkrow has since been outclassed by various other support Pokemon that have been added to the game, but there's no question this Pokemon was made better by the existence of Honchkrow. Sadly, better than Honchkrow itself, as it actually loses the ability that makes it so good in VGC, Prankster, replacing it with the much less desirable ability Moxie. An extremely rare case of a Pokemon actually losing its best tool upon evolving. As for Dusclops, Eviolite makes this thing a nearly unkillable wall in the VGC format, and it saw a ton of usage throughout the Sword and Shield VGC meta, while its evolved form Dusknoir saw zero usage across the board. I mean, when you look at these two stats side by side, it's easy to see why. Dusknoir does have a substantially higher attack stat of 100 compared to Dusclops' 70, but seeing as how its physical moves are relatively weak, that point is pretty much moot. The 45 speed is not doing you any favors compared to 25, in fact that actually just makes Dusknoir worse in Trick Room teams if anything. And having 5 more in each of its defenses is irrelevant when Eviolite is boosting Dusclops' defense and special defense to a staggering 195. This thing is literally bulkier than Deoxys' defense form. Unfortunately with only a fraction of the utility, but still, it's a good measuring stick. And just one of a few examples of why evolving your Pokemon may not always be the best thing. Maybe we owe Ash Ketchum an apology. So that's just a look at a few of the most influential cross-generation evolutions. Which one do you think was the most important? Let me know in the comments down below. But don't forget to leave a like in this video if you enjoyed, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and I'll see you guys next time.